George Orson Welles was an American actor, director, writer, and producer who worked in theatre, radio, and film. He is remembered for his innovative work in all three. In theatre, most notably Caesar, a Broadway adaptation of William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. In radio, the 1938 broadcast The War of the Worlds, one of the most famous in the history of radio, and in film, Citizen Kane, consistently ranked as one of the all-time greatest films. Welles directed a number of high-profile stage productions for the Federal Theatre Project in his early 20s, including an innovative adaptation of Macbeth with an entirely African-American cast, and the political musical The Cradle Will Rock. In 1937 he and John Houseman founded the Mercury Theatre, an independent repertory theatre company that presented an acclaimed series of productions on Broadway through 1941. Welles found national and international fame as the director and narrator of a 1938 radio adaptation of H.G. Wells' novel The War of the Worlds, performed for his radio anthology series The Mercury Theatre on the air. It reportedly caused widespread panic when listeners thought that an invasion by extraterrestrial beings was occurring. Although some contemporary sources claim these reports of panic were mostly false and overstated, they rocketed Welles to notoriety. His first film was Citizen Kane, which he co-wrote, produced, directed, and starred in as Charles Foster Kane. Welles was an outsider to the studio system and directed only 13 full-length films in his career. He struggled for creative control on his projects early on with the major film studios and later in life with a variety of independent financiers, and his films were either heavily edited or remained unreleased. His distinctive directorial style featured leader non-linear narrative forms, innovative uses of lighting such as chiaroscuro, unusual camera angles, sound techniques borrowed from radio, deep focus shots, and long takes. He has been praised as a major creative force and as the ultimate auteur. Welles followed up Citizen Kane with critically acclaimed films, including The Magnificent Ambitions in 1942 and Touch of Evil in 1958. Although these three are his most acclaimed films, critics have argued other works of his, such as The Lady from Shanghai and Chimes at Midnight, are underappreciated. In 2002, Welles was voted the greatest film director of all time in two British Film Institute polls among directors and critics, and a wide survey of critical consensus, best of lists, and historical retrospectives calls him the most acclaimed director of all time. Well known for his baritone voice, Welles was a well-regarded actor in radio and film, a celebrated Shakespearean stage actor, and an accomplished magician noted for presenting troupe variety shows in the war years. Early life. George Orson Welles was born May 6, 1915, in Kenosha, Wisconsin, son of Richard Head Wells and Beatrice Ives Wells. He was named after his paternal great-grandfather, influential Kenosha attorney Orson S. Head, and his brother George Head. Despite his family's affluence, Welles encountered hardship in childhood. His parents separated and moved to Chicago in 1919. His father, who made a fortune as the inventor of a popular bicycle lamp, became an alcoholic and stopped working. Wells's mother, a pianist, played during lectures by Dudley Crafts Watson at the Art Institute of Chicago to support her son and herself. The oldest Welles boy, Dickie, was institutionalized at an early age because he had learning difficulties. Beatrice died of hepatitis in a Chicago hospital May 10, 1924, aged 42, just after Wells's 9th birthday. The Gordon String Quartet, which had made its first appearance at her home in 1921, played at Beatrice's funeral. After his mother's death, Welles ceased pursuing music. It was decided that he would spend the summer with the Watson family at a private art colony in Wyoming, New York, established by Lydia Avery Coonley Ward. There he played and became friends with the children of the Aga Khan, including the 12-year-old Prince Ali Khan. Then, in what Welles later described as the hectic period in his life, he lived in a Chicago apartment with both his father and Dr. Morris Bernstein, a Chicago physician who had been a close friend of both his parents. Welles briefly attended public school before his alcoholic father left business altogether and took him along on his travels to Jamaica and the Far East. When they returned, they settled in a hotel in Grand Detour, Illinois, that was owned by his father. When the hotel burned down, Welles and his father took to the road again. During the 3 years that Orson lived with his father, some observers wondered who took care of whom, wrote biographer Frank Brady. In some ways, he was never really a young boy, you know, said Roger Hill, who became Welles's teacher and lifelong friend. Welles briefly attended public school in Madison, Wisconsin, enrolled in the 4th grade. On September 15, 1926, he entered the Todd Seminary for Boys, an expensive independent school in Woodstock, Illinois, that his older brother, Richard Ives Welles, had attended 10 years before but was expelled for misbehavior. At Todd's school, Welles came under the influence of Roger Hill, a teacher who was later Todd's headmaster. Hill provided Welles with an ad hoc educational environment that proved invaluable to his creative experience, allowing Welles to concentrate on subjects that interested him. Welles performed and staged theatrical experiments and productions there. Todd provided Welles with many valuable experiences, wrote critic Richard France. He was able to explore and experiment in an atmosphere of acceptance and encouragement. In addition to a theater, the school's own radio station was at his disposal. Welles's first radio performance was on the Todd station, an adaptation of Sherlock Holmes that he also wrote. On December 28, 1930, when Welles was 15, his father died of heart and kidney failure at the age of 58, alone in a hotel in Chicago. Shortly before this, Welles had announced to his father that he would stop seeing him, believing it would prompt his father to refrain from drinking. As a result, Orson felt guilty because he believed his father had drunk himself to death because of him. His father's will left it to Orson to name his guardian. When Roger Hill declined, Welles chose Morris Bernstein. Following graduation from Todd in May 1931, Welles was awarded a scholarship to Harvard University, while his mentor Roger Hill advocated he attend Cornell College in Iowa. Rather than enrolling, he chose travel. He studied for a few weeks at the Art Institute of Chicago with Boris Annersfeld, who encouraged him to pursue painting. Welles would occasionally return to Woodstock, the place he eventually named when he was asked in a 1960 interview, "Where is home?" Welles replied, "I suppose it's Woodstock, Illinois, if it's anywhere. I went to school for 4 years. If I try to think of a home, it's that." Early career. After his father's death, Welles traveled to Europe using a small portion of his inheritance. Welles said that while on a walking and painting trip through Ireland, he strode into the Gate Theatre in Dublin and claimed he was a Broadway star. The manager of Gate, Hilton Edwards, later said he had not believed him but was impressed by his brashness and an impassioned audition he gave. Welles made his stage debut at the Gate Theatre on October 13, 1931. appearing in Ashley Dukes's adaptation of Julius's Duke Karl Alexander of Württemberg. He performed small supporting roles in subsequent Gate productions, and he produced and designed productions of his own in Dublin. In March 1932, Welles performed in W. Somerset Maugham's The Circle at Dublin's Abbey Theatre and travelled to London to find additional work in the theatre. Unable to obtain a work permit, he returned to the U.S. Welles found his fame ephemeral and turned to a writing project at Todd School that would become the immensely successful, first entitled Everybody's Shakespeare and subsequently The Mercury Shakespeare. Welles travelled to North Africa while working on thousands of illustrations for the Everybody's Shakespeare series of educational books, a series that remained in print for decades. In 1933, Roger and Hortense Hill invited Welles to a party in Chicago, where Welles met Thornton Wilder. Wilder arranged for Welles to meet Alexander Woollcott in New York, in order that he be introduced to Katharine Cornell, who was assembling a repertory theatre company. Cornell's husband, director Guthrie McClintock, immediately put Welles under contract and cast him in 3 plays: Romeo and Juliet, The Barretts of Wimpole Street and Candida. Toured in repertory for 36 weeks beginning in November 1933, with the first of more than 200 performances taking place in Buffalo, New York. In 1934, Welles got his first job on radio on the American School of the Air through actor-director Paul Stewart, who introduced him to director Noel Zentreken. That summer Welles staged a drama festival with the Todd School in Woodstock, Illinois, inviting McKeel MacLeanwar and Hilton Edwards from Dublin's Gate Theatre to appear along with New York stage luminaries in productions including Trilby, Hamlet, The Drunkard and Tsar Paul. At the Old Firehouse in Woodstock he also shot his first film, an 8-minute short titled The Hearts of Age. On November 14, 1934, Welles married Chicago socialite and actress Virginia Nicholson in a civil ceremony in New York. To appease the Nicholsons, who were furious at the couple's elopement, a formal ceremony took place December 23, 1934, at the New Jersey mansion of the bride's godmother. Welles wore a cutaway borrowed from his friend George Macready. A revised production of Katharine Cornell's Romeo and Juliet opened December 20, 1934, at the Martin Beck Theatre in New York. The Broadway production brought the 19-year-old Welles to the notice of John Houseman, a theatrical producer who was casting the lead role in the debut production of Archibald MacLeish's verse play, Panic. On March 22, 1935, Welles made his debut on the CBS radio series The March of Time, performing a scene from Panic for a news report on the stage production. By 1935, Welles was supplementing his earnings in the theatre as a radio actor in Manhattan, working with many actors who would later form the core of his Mercury Theatre on programs including America's Hour, Cavalcade of America, Columbia Workshop and The March of Time. Within a year of his debut, Welles could claim membership in that elite band of radio actors who commanded salaries second only to the highest paid movie stars, wrote critic Richard France. Theatre, Federal Theatre Project, part of the Works Progress Administration. The Federal Theatre Project was a New Deal program to fund theatre and other live artistic performances and entertainment programs in the United States during the Great Depression. It was created as a relief measure to employ artists, writers, directors and theatre workers. Under National Director Hallie Flanagan, it was shaped into a true national theatre that created relevant art, encouraged experimentation and innovation, and made it possible for millions of Americans to see live theatre for the first time. John Houseman, director of the Negro Theatre Unit in New York, invited Welles to join the Federal Theatre Project in 1935. Far from unemployed, I was so employed I forgot how to sleep. Welles put a large share of his $1,500 a week radio earnings into his stage productions, bypassing administrative red tape and mounting the projects more quickly and professionally. Roosevelt once said that I was the only operator in history who ever illegally siphoned money into a Washington project. Welles said, "The Federal Theatre project was the ideal environment in which Welles could develop his art. Its purpose was employment, so he was able to hire any number of artists, craftsmen and technicians, and he filled the stage with performers." The company for the first production, an adaptation of William Shakespeare's Macbeth with an entirely African-American cast, numbered 150. The production became known as the Voodoo Macbeth because Welles changed the setting to a mythical island suggesting the Haitian court of King Henry Christophe, with Haitian Vodou fulfilling the role of Scottish witchcraft. The play opened April 14, 1936, at the Lafayette Theatre in Harlem and was received rapturously. At 20, Welles was hailed as a prodigy. The production then made a 4,000-mile national tour that included 2 weeks at the Texas Centennial Exposition in Dallas. Next mounted was The Fast Horse Eats Hat, an adaptation by Welles and Edwin Denby of the Italian Straw Hat, an 1851 5-act farce by Eugene Marin Labiche and Marc Michel. The play was presented September 26–December 5, 1936, at Maxine Elliott's Theatre, New York, and featured Joseph Cotten in his first starring role. It was followed by an adaptation of Dr. Faustus that used light as a prime unifying scenic element in a nearly black stage, presented January 8–May 9, 1937, at Maxine Elliott's Theatre. Outside the scope of the Federal Theatre project, American composer Aaron Copland chose Welles to direct the second Hurricane, an operetta with a libretto by Edwin Denby, presented at the Henry Street Settlement Music School in New York for the benefit of high school students. The production opened April 21, 1937, and ran its scheduled 3 performances. In 1937, Welles rehearsed Mark Blitzstein's political operetta, The Cradle Will Rock. It was originally scheduled to open June 16, 1937, in its first public preview. Because of severe federal cutbacks in the work's progress projects, the show's premiere at the Maxine Elliott Theatre was cancelled. The theatre was locked and guarded to prevent any government-purchased materials from being used for a commercial production of the work. In a last-minute move, Welles announced to waiting ticket holders that the show was being transferred to the Venice, 20 blocks away. Some cast and some crew and audience walked the distance on foot. The union musicians refused to perform in a commercial theatre for lower non-union government wages. The Actors Union stated that the production belonged to the Federal Theatre project and could not be performed outside that context without permission, lacking the participation of the union members. The Cradle Will Rock began with Blitzstein introducing the show and playing the piano accompaniment on stage with some cast members performing from the audience. This impromptu performance was well received by its audience. Mercury Theatre breaking with the Federal Theatre project in 1937, Welles and Houseman founded their own repertory company, which they called the Mercury Theatre. The name was inspired by the title of the iconoclastic magazine, The American Mercury. Welles was executive producer, and the original company included such actors as Joseph Cotten, George Couliouris, Geraldine Fitzgerald, Arlene Francis, Martin Gable, John Hoyt, Norman Lloyd, Vincent Price, Stephen Schnabel and Hiram Sherman. I think he was the greatest directorial talent we've ever had in the theatre. Theatre, Lloyd said of Welles in a 2014 interview. When you saw a Welles production, you saw the text had been affected. The staging was remarkable. The sets were unusual. Music, sound, lighting, a totality of everything. We had not had such a man in our theatre. He was the first and remains the greatest. The Mercury Theatre opened November 11, 1937, with Caesar, Welles's modern dress adaptation of Shakespeare's tragedy Julius Caesar, streamlined into an anti-fascist tour de force that Joseph Cotton later described as so vigorous, so contemporary that it set Broadway on its ear. The set was completely open with no curtain, and the brick stage wall was painted dark red. Scene changes were achieved by lighting alone. On the stage was a series of rises. Squares were cut into one at intervals and lights were set beneath it, pointing straight up to evoke the Cathedral of Light at the Nuremberg rallies. He staged it like a political melodrama that happened the night before, said Lloyd. Beginning January 1, 1938, Caesar was performed in repertory with The Shoemaker's Holiday. Both productions moved to the larger National Theatre. They were followed by Heartbreak House and Danton's Death, as well as being presented in a pared-down oratorio version at the Mercury Theatre on Sunday nights in December 1937. The Cradle Will was at the Windsor Theatre for 13 weeks. Such was the success of the Mercury Theatre that Welles appeared on the cover of Time magazine, in full makeup as Captain Shotover in Heartbreak House, in the issue dated May 9, 1938, 3 days after his 23rd birthday. Radio. Simultaneously with his work in the theatre, Welles worked extensively in radio as an actor, writer, director and producer, often without credit. Between 1935 and 1937 he was earning as much as $2,000 a week, shuttling between radio studios at such a pace that he would arrive barely in time for a quick scan of his lines before he was on the air. While he was directing the Voodoo Macbeth, Welles was dashing between Harlem and Midtown Manhattan 3 times a day to meet his radio commitments, in addition to continuing as a repertory player on the March of Time. In the fall of 1936, Welles adapted and performed Hamlet in an early 2-part episode of CBS Radio's Columbia Workshop. His performance as the announcer in the series' April 1937 presentation of Archibald MacLeish's verse drama The Fall of the City was an important development in his radio career and made the 21-year-old Welles an overnight star. In July 1937, the Mutual Network gave Welles a 7-week series to adapt Les Miserables. It was his first job as a writer-director for radio, the radio debut of the Mercury Theatre, and one of Welles's earliest and finest achievements. He invented the use of narration in radio, by making himself the center of the storytelling process. Welles fostered the impression of self-adulation that was to haunt his career to his dying day, wrote critic Andrew Saris. For the most part, however, Welles was singularly generous to the other members of his cast and inspired loyalty from them above and beyond the call of professionalism. That September, Mutual chose Welles to play Lamont Cranston, also known as The Shadow. He performed the role anonymously through mid-September 1938. The Mercury Theatre on the air after the theatrical successes of the Mercury Theatre. CBS Radio invited Orson Welles to create a summer show for 13 weeks. The series began July 11, 1938, initially titled First Person Singular, with the formula that Welles would play the lead in each show. Some months later the show was called the Mercury Theatre on the Air. The weekly hour-long show presented radio plays based on classic literary works, with original music composed and conducted by Bernard Herrmann. The Mercury Theatre's radio adaptation of The War of the Worlds by H.G. Welles. October 30, 1938, brought Welles instant fame. The combination of the news bulletin form of the performance with the between-break style spinning habits of listeners was later reported to have created widespread confusion among listeners who failed to hear the introduction, although the extent of this confusion has come into question. Panic was reportedly spread among listeners who believed the fictional news reports of a Martian invasion. The myth of the result created by the combination was reported as fact around the world and disparagingly mentioned by Adolf Hitler in a public speech some months later. Welles's growing fame drew Hollywood office lures that the independent-minded Welles resisted at first. The Mercury Theatre on the Air, which had been a sustaining show, was picked up by Campbell Soup and renamed the Campbell Playhouse. The Mercury Theatre on the Air made its last broadcast on December 4, 1938, and the Campbell Playhouse began 5 days later. Welles began commuting from Hollywood to New York for the two Sunday broadcasts of the Campbell Playhouse after signing a film contract with RKO Pictures in August 1939. In November 1939, production of the show moved from New York to Los Angeles. After 20 shows, Campbell began to exercise more creative control and had complete control over story selection. As his contract with Campbell came to an end, Welles chose not to sign on for another season. After the broadcast of March 31, 1940, Welles and Campbell parted amicably.